Thank you, everybody, for joining the session. I'd love to introduce Luis Nino, Digital Manager, Technology, Ventures, and Innovation from Chevron, joining me for this session. We've been on a journey, and I say we, because
Proverbial we.
Yeah, well, we, but I've also known you for a little while now, and I've seen you grow through this transformation.
Yeah.
And another part of this is HR isn't necessarily where you normally play in your day-to-day life.
True.
Right? You're from the IT world.
Yeah.
And you got pulled into this as part of digital transformation.
It was a personal transformation as much as a
personal transformation,
HR
too.
transformation.
So as a way of introduction for the audience, can you kind of give a little background onto your role at Chevron and kind of the start of the project and the journey?
Sure. So currently, so I was not an HR professional. Then I was for a little while, and now I'm not again. My current role is I'm the digital manager for our technology ventures team in Chevron. We do some venture capital, we do external technology de-risking that we bring in to any area of the Chevron value chain to help solve some of our problems. When we started this journey a while ago, my job was the digital transformation manager for the HR function in Chevron. And so my remit was to explore where we were from a technology standpoint, and what were some of the opportunities and changes that we needed to continue to make to get HR to where we wanted to the vision that we had of the function. Now, when I came in, we had already started that, where this really, like the very genesis of this thing was back in 2016, maybe, when we realized that we were too dispersed. Ashu talked about the number of technologies that some of the companies here have, or I'm guessing around the world have.
Did that feel familiar?
Oh yeah, 100%. And it was funny, he said, oh, it's maybe 40, 50. We have 204 applications that we used this day. We used to have many, many more in HR.
So 204 is progress.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
It's a good number. So where we started was actually rationalizing our HRIS systems. And we did that from 2016, 17 through 2019, 2020. That's when I came into this. And that's how this whole thing was born.
Now, one of the things I've heard you talk about that I've also experienced in my own professional life working on transformation projects is painting the picture for leadership on exactly what you're trying to accomplish and where you're trying to go. But one of the things that we often forget is we get so excited about where we're trying to go, we don't often paint the full picture of where we are to show the value of the before and the after. And I've heard you talk about this. Can you kind of speak to a little bit of the learning from kind of where you started to where you wanted to go and that exercise?
Yeah, and so I think if you look at this chronologically, when we rationalized into a single HRIS system, we claimed victory, right? And by and large, it was an important victory. It's not an easy thing to do. I forget the number of systems that we had that we collapsed into one, the ability to have a single data foundation, the ability to have workflows that were, for the most part, standardized. That was a gigantic win, but that doesn't mean anything to the business. That means a lot to HR. It doesn't mean a lot to the business. If you can't translate it into business value, it doesn't mean a lot. And so helping people understand what this transition meant, it took us years. It took us years to engage business leadership and explain, hey, because of this, we can now be faster. We can now be agile. We can now be more nimble, right? And it took a lot. As we started progressing into the space of skills, it took a lot to explain to, or it's still taking a lot, to explain to our HR leadership what this can do, because it is connected, right? These two topics are connected. The idea of creating value for the HR function and optimizing what the things that we do versus the idea of creating business value, right? There's only certain differential value you can create in impacting your workflows versus exponential value you can create when impacting the business. And so you want to make sure that you make the case for both. It took us quite a bit to do that. And it also, my professional life I've spent for the most part in IT. And so making sure that we're able to explain the impact that interfaces have in the back end in data, that's not something that comes easy to many people in the business or in HR. And so simplifying some of those conversations has been something that we've been working really hard at.
Now, Luis, in your own words, I've heard you say, as you went through this project and you went through this transformation, you started talking about the HRIS and you started looking at TA and other areas, and you fell into what you refer to as the skills rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So this is a chart that you've created that I love as you explain it and kind of walk through as to what this means for Chevron and how this was a big part of the transformation journey. Can you walk us through it?
Yeah. So what you're going to see here, it's only 3 slides, but what you're going to see here is some frameworks that we put together as we went through this process and this journey. None of this is new. We've used these frameworks in many areas, in and outside of HR. I was thinking about this last night, and I think where we started with this was if instead of that title you scratch skills and you say jobs, that's where we started. We started with the jobs use case, and we said, well, what does the job economy look like, right? You have a certain demand, you have a certain supply. We have a demand we have open jobs that we need to fill. We have subject matter experts that we need. There were what I call vectors of change that are still impacting us. At the time, the pandemic was a big one. Obviously, the energy transition is a major issue for us. Lower carbon is an important part of our strategy. And so there was that demand side for jobs, right? Well, and so if you look at where it says skills needed, you can also scratch skills and say jobs. What are the jobs needed, right? However, if you look at the supply side and you look at skills available, you can't say jobs available there because you don't fill jobs with jobs. You fill jobs with people. And so that's when we started understanding, okay, this jobs equation doesn't quite work. We need to figure out a way to equate our understanding of jobs and our understanding of people. We know what that demand looks like. We know what are the jobs that we have. We know what are those line of business that we have in Chevron that are new. We have hydrogen. We have carbon capture. We have carbon offsets, right? What about our people? How do we know our people? How do we understand our talent? And that's when we started sort of diving into that rabbit hole because we believed that by leveraging skills, we could get to understand our talent pool better. The other insight as we were going through this framework was, okay, where's that data? How do we find that data? And there's a lot of talk about data cleansing and data quality, and you can't start I think Ashu mentioned that you can't start if you don't have it. You have to start somewhere. And a lot of, Simona mentioned proxies. I loved it.
I love that too, yeah.
She stole my thunder, but it's okay. It's okay. We use a lot of proxies to understand skills, right? And so if we look at resumes, you have that list there. Resumes are nothing but proxies for skills. When you look at somebody's experience, somebody's education, you're inferring that because they did this, they can do that, right? They built that skill. They build that skill over time, and they can go and do some of these other things, right? But that's happening in your brain. That assumption is happening almost automatically for our talent acquisition specialists, right? It becomes a little bit more complicated if you're looking at the vectors of change. And so, for example, with emerging lines of businesses, one of the areas that we're focusing on right now is hydrogen. How do we produce hydrogen? There's different types of, I'm not going to get into the technicalities of hydrogen production.
For this conversation.
But for this conversation, what we were looking at is, okay, this job doesn't exist. How do we find the talent to fill that job? How do we find the talent where do we find the engineers that do carbon storage? We haven't done this in the past, right? Well, if you think about it with the level of granularity that skills allows, right? We actually had people who are experts in water management. And so there are some of our assets when for every barrel of oil we produce 7 or 8 of water. And so we manage tremendous amounts of water. We have experts who know how to store it, how to treat it, how to redistribute it. And when you think about hydrogen and breaking the water molecule for hydrogen and oxygen, these people can do that because they've been doing it, right? But if you think about it from a jobs perspective, you'll never make that connection. If you think about it from a skills perspective, it's an easy transition, right?
So one of the things that you've talked about is what you're able to accomplish with tools like talent intelligence. And as we think about it, here's another Luis Nino classic here. Just the use of kind of the granularity of skills in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
And what this provides that's much different from kind of tagging and mapping skills to kind of understanding skills through the power of AI. So as you've walked through kind of the journey that Chevron was on and how you were starting to look at potentially aligning and nurturing and managing talent for roles that had never existed in the organization, can you talk to some of the benefits of this granularity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what this slide also aims to do is to connect the back end and the front end. Because one of my concerns as we were looking into this space was everybody has a marketplace now. Every company that I was talking to had a marketplace. Every company that I was talking to said they were doing AI, and the devil's in the details. You have to be able to understand, well, okay, it's great that you're an AI company now, but how did you become an AI company? Did you just drop ChatGPT on top of your databases? And if so, how effective is that? Because I'll tell you right now, it's not that effective, right? Or were you AI first? The AI first thing, people sometimes take it for granted. What matters about AI first is not so much actually the AI, it's the way you set up your data, the way that you allow the data to learn. And so what you see at the bottom of this slide is a depiction of relationships between skills. That's how AI first companies need to think about their data, and not everybody's, actually very few companies are set up like that from the go. I'm going to take a step back. In the previous slide, we looked at the skills economy, and it was a two-sided network, right? If you think about, when I say two-sided networks, I want you to think about companies maybe like Uber or Amazon, where you have 2 sides to the equation. In Uber, you need drivers and you need riders. And the more riders you have, the more drivers you have. And the more drivers you have, the quicker you can provide a service, so the more riders you have. And one of those areas needs to be, one of those sides of that network needs to be subsidized, meaning you need to make it easy for them to come in, right? If you're Apple and you have the iPhone, right, you want to make it easy for people to build apps, right? And so you build a software development kit that's easy for programmers, and you give them the tools and you train them to build apps so that you have a massive offering of applications that people will then want to use on their phone. It's the same thing with this two-sided network, except that in this two-sided network, who you want to subsidize is your users. You have the people that are bringing the skills into this and the people that are demanding this. And so what you see on the screen here is a depiction of the marketplace at the top. That's how you subsidize your users, is you expose them to opportunities, right? That's the promise of the marketplace. And so you tell them, hey, if you go here and you provide the data, right, you can learn what are the right opportunities for you, what are those gigs, who are those mentors. You saw in Ashu's presentations, like, who can I talk to, right? We will be able to give you that. What we need from you is your data to make sure we understand what are the paths that you have to be able to grow, right? And so the lower part of the slide depicts the relationship to the back end, to the data layer, and how those things happen. If you don't have a very strong data layer that enables that hyper-personalization in the marketplace, that marketplace won't work. And so you see these, I don't know what to call those things, but you see those relationships down there, and what I try to do here is explain why clustering and contextualization is important in the back end, right? And so if you look at the example here, you see Java as the center skill for the whatever spider thing that is, and you see some of the relationships that it has. And so if you look at Java and it has high correlations to things like espresso and latte and tea, you're talking about coffee. But if you look at Java and you see a high correlation to things like SQL and Python, you are talking about coding languages. These are very different conversations. And so if I don't have the ability to do this, and I have Java on my resume, I'm going to tell you that you need to be a barista, but you're a software engineer. That's not going to work, right? It happened to me with one of the test cases we were looking at, for some reason, this thing thought that I would be a great janitor after I had this job in HR, and it was not quite the career that I wanted to follow.
We do clean things up quite a bit.
Yeah, I guess maybe some data cleansing or something, and it interpreted it like that.
Yeah.
But those are the things that you encounter if you don't have that ability in the back end. The other ability that this creates, and you didn't ask this question, but I'll just jump straight into this, because I know you will ask it.
It's coming.
It allows you to, in a sense, estimate potential, right? And what I mean by that, that's a loaded way of saying it, but what I mean by that is, if you understand the correlations between skills, and you understand the demand that you have for a particular set of skills, you will also understand the person's ability to build it. And so in the case of the coder, if we are looking for someone who's a software developer that knows React Native, right? But in their job description, they only said that they knew Java and Python. They didn't say they know React Native. If you have a static system, that person is out of your list. You're not going to consider them, even if they're a star, right? But if you have a system that enables that, well, what you can think, the way you start thinking about it is, okay, he didn't declare the skill. That doesn't mean he doesn't have it, or it doesn't mean she cannot learn it, right? And so you start thinking about this from the perspective of how close are they to the clustering of skills that we need for the specific opportunity.
Well, I was going to ask that question because this speaks to kind of the 3 dimensions of skills in a skills graph, where you can look at recency, relevancy, frequency, and context to get at some prediction of proficiency.
Right.
So this gives you some added contextualization for decision making and for predictions that's much more than just tagging or static data. Now, the other part about this that you mentioned that also speaks to some of the other themes from this morning is the win-win of this. You know, talent intelligence is often characterized as having a win-win in providing value for the employees in that marketplace, right? Because it's dynamic, it's continuing to evolve, it's personalized, it's connecting to opportunities in real time continuously, and it's driving interest and adoption and learning as it goes. So it's a win-win because it's driving that engagement for the employees and for the talent, but it's continuously informing and feeding knowledge to the organization, right? So this is exactly what you're talking about in this kind of dynamic marketplace.
Yep.
But this speaks to where we're headed, where, you know, we're talking about this conversation around what does it mean to transform? And it's not enough to take what you're doing today and optimize it or make it faster or more efficient. It's potentially to clear the table and figure out what do we need for the future? What is the problem we're solving? How do we get there? And sometimes you have to figure out its policy, its culture, its practice, its process, its metrics, its technology, it's all of them. And it's not just enhancing what we do today, it's building a new future.
Right.
So as part of this, with the build, buy, borrow strategy, we shift the conversation from time to fill to how you fill, and you get that granularity of talent signals and talent understanding through skills to have a multiple dimension strategy to address some of these talent needs, especially when you're working for things that are more proactive for the future. So in the context of Chevron, can you kind of explain what this offered to the organization?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to your win-win comment, because it's that win-win needs to be analyzed from the perspective of both parties in that equation, right? For the individual, you're giving them a win when it comes from a development perspective, okay? So your employee has access to opportunities, whatever those may be, gigs, learning, a new job, participation in a project. For the company, the win moniker is assessed most likely, and through the most popular cases, through jobs. And it goes back to what I talked about in the first slide. You have to be able to understand jobs, and that's what we've been doing, Simona said it, since the Industrial Revolution, right? And you have to be able to understand people. And that's what this talent intelligence thing is about. Systems traditionally, particularly HRIS systems, are built on the idea of understanding organizational structures and hierarchies. They understand jobs. They understand job architectures, job catalogs, job descriptions. They have a very hard time understanding a person, right? And so the promise here is, how do you start understanding with a reasonable level of detail in real time the person and the aggregated group of people called talent, right? So that win-win is very nuanced as well, because you have to recognize it from both sides. Coming back to this, at this point we sort of took it back to, again, a framework that's known to most of us in this room, if not all, and it's the build, buy, and borrow framework. And so we started thinking, okay, well, what does this mean from this perspective? How is this going to impact our HR operations? But more importantly, how can this create value to the business? Like I mentioned, we can optimize our HR operations by 10%, or we can impact our business by 0.1%, and that 0.1% is much more powerful, right? And so how do we create value as we continue to optimize the business? It doesn't have to be an either-or proposition. And this is the way we started understanding how we could create that value. When we were looking at the build option in build, buy, borrow, well, now you have this marketplace that can hyper-personalize the way that people grow in their careers. You don't have to think about, well, Jason went through, this is how he went through his career, and this is how Mark went through his career. You now have 150 different people in the past 55 years that went in different ways to get to a particular point. You can provide the proverbial lattice versus the ladder, right? You can do that through the build equation. When we talk about buy, everybody's, I think, at this point familiar with the buy proposition. But there's something that's very interesting that was almost a given when we started looking at the matching capabilities through skills for talent acquisition, and that's the experience, the prospects, the candidates' experience. What was really important to us when we first started doing this was, how can we make it easy for the candidate to know us? Forever, we've asked people, well, go into this website, do your research, figure out if you're a data engineer 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or a software engineer 1, 2, 3, or an application engineer 1, 2, 3, and apply to the right job for you. And that expectation has shifted, particularly with newer generations.
As someone who used to lead talent acquisition for more than a decade, we used to value endurance.
Yeah. And so now you make it easy for them. You tell them, hey, we want to get to know you. Tell us about you through some of those proxies, right? Give us your resume. Give us, if you've published something, tell it to us. If you have a profile in LinkedIn, show it to us. Like how can we get to know you before you even apply, before you even have to create a job rec? Because that's the other thing that we struggled with, was this idea, this decoupling, as I mentioned, of jobs and people, right? You can do all of this without ever opening a job rec, right? And so it's not so much about the process of the HR process itself. It's a lot about how we get to know that person, right? And so in the buy proposition, this is transformational. And then you look at borrow. Borrow's an interesting one. I think there can be a lot more emphasis on this option when it comes to closing the gap. There's many companies that are doing very interesting things with borrowing talent. In our case, we're a company that has a ratio of 1 to 2, employees versus contractors. We have a lot of contractors. We perform this sort of co-petition with some of our oil and gas peers. Many of our projects we do with Exxon and with Shell and BP and whatnot. And so it's important that we have a system that allows us to look at the talent spectrum beyond our walls. Simona and Chano struggled with it, and I will too. Boundaryless.
Boundaryless.
And so you need to be boundaryless, but you see, you need to be boundaryless when you're looking at talent, because we are not in a closed environment. Chevron is not in a closed environment. We partner with many organizations to fill the gap talent, and that's where borrow is a key lever for us to pull when it comes to closing the skills gap. The other thing that I'm going to say here that we touched on when we were talking about this is the role of AI as part of your talent pool, because that's coming, and it's coming real fast, right? And so for all build, buy, and borrow, you need to start thinking about where do you build, where do you buy, and where do you borrow AI to close your skill gaps. Everybody's mentioned it, you saw it in the news with GPT-4o and Gemini Live and some others. They provide good skills. I don't know if you looked at that little video with GPT-4o, where GPT is coaching the kid through I don't know, an arithmetic or geometry problem, and it does a fantastic job of coaching the kid through solving the problem. We need to start thinking about how AI plays a role in each one of these things. And so if you're still struggling with understanding how skills have a role to play here, and it's going to take you a while to get through it, you better accelerate, because AI is here, and it's here yesterday. This is not a thing of the future.
So I want to ask you just a couple more questions before we close. So we talked about how you came to this HR project from the IT world. So joining the HR function, what did you learn about HR?
It's one of the best jobs I've had in Chevron. I've been in the company for 16 years, and this was 3 years that I loved. What I will say is HR has the ability to provide much more value than they think they can. This idea of being the best service provider for the business is a fantastic idea, but it's not a differentiator. And so you have to have the mindset of the differentiator. This provides the capability to impact business results immediately, right? Understanding your talent pool and moving the talent pool at speed and with flexibility, this changes the business side. And so that was one of the lessons that I took, is we are our own worst enemy when it comes to moving things ahead. Now that I'm on the business side, I will tell you that if somebody comes to me and says, hey, we're testing skills and this and that, I will say, good, let me know what happens, right? It's not the overwhelming roadblock that we thought it was to try some of these things. That's an important lesson for me coming out of the HR job.
And with the pace of change, you already touched on this a little bit, but you can't sit still. We need to get faster to just stay in the same place in the race. What do you think is next?
That's a tough one. I think this is going to continue to expand, and it's going to force us to reevaluate the user experience. I think Ashu talked about it a little bit. He talked about the proliferation of apps, and he was looking at HR, right? When you think about your average employee, they're not looking at how many apps we have in HR. In fact, if I hadn't worked in HR, I would have had no idea. But while we have 204 applications in HR, in total we have somewhere around 6,000 or 7,000 in Chevron, right? Nobody cares about that number because it's too much to take on, right? All they care about is what are the systems that they work in. And so the reason why I think this is going to become an important part of that is the conversation with your AI is going to have to be a companion to the person, not a companion to the app. And so I don't want to have one Copilot for Microsoft Word, one Copilot for Eightfold, one Copilot for the Grid, one Copilot for ServiceNow. I want to have a Copilot for Luis, right? And so how we start organizing our data and how we start organizing our user experience is going to be critical to fulfill those expectations.
Well, Luis, you and I first started talking about this almost 5 years ago now.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you being a champion for Eightfold, but a champion for talent intelligence and really what this technology can do that's different from some of the tools that have been in our hands in the past. And I want to thank you for taking the time to share the journey with the crowd today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.